December 15th, 1944. The world is caught in the grinding, industrial friction of the Second World War. The map of Europe is a shifting mosaic of liberated zones and occupied territories. But our focus narrows down to a singular, desolate point in Bedfordshire, United Kingdom. Twinwood Farm. It is an airfield, though perhaps that term implies too much order. It is a muddy stretch of grass, an auxiliary station used by the Royal Air Force, currently hosting the American 8th Air Force. The atmosphere is heavy, not just with the weight of the war, but with the physical presence of the weather. A thick, freezing fog clings to the ground. The British call it a pea souper. It is the kind of weather that muffles sound and distorts distance, turning the familiar into the uncanny. Standing on the tarmac, shivering in the damp chill, is a man whose name is synonymous with the vibrant, brassy sound of American optimism. Major Glenn Miller. At 40 years old, he is the most famous bandleader in the world. His music is the soundtrack of a generation, a rhythmic counterargument to the chaos of combat. But here, on this gray afternoon, there is no music. There is only the low idle of a single engine and the biting cold. Miller is anxious. He is a man who prefers the solid ground of a stage to the unpredictable currents of the air. He has spent the last few years trading the safety of commercial success for the rigors of service, bringing his Army Air Force band to the troops. They are scheduled to play a Christmas broadcast from Paris, a city recently liberated from Nazi control. The band is already en route by sea, but Miller, impatient and driven by duty, has arranged a private flight to arrive early and prepare the arrangements. The vehicle for this transit is a UC-64 Norseman. It is a utilitarian aircraft, high-winged, single-engined, designed for bush flying in Canada, not for crossing the treacherous English Channel in winter. It is small, fragile, and entirely unsuited for the conditions that are rapidly closing in around Bedfordshire. The pilot is Flight Officer John Morgan. He is young, confident, perhaps too confident for the weather reports that have grounded hundreds of heavy bombers across the region. Beside Miller stands Lieutenant Colonel Norman Biesel, a man known for his brash demeanor and a casual disregard for safety protocols. It is Biesel who arranged the flight. It is Biesel who urges them forward. Witnesses at the airfield later recount a brief, chilling exchange. Miller, peering into the gray soup of the sky, asks Biesel where the parachutes are. Biesel laughs. He asks Miller if he intends to live forever. It is a throwaway line, a piece of gallows humor common in wartime, but in hindsight, it lands with the weight of a prophecy. At 1:55 in the afternoon, the Norseman taxis out. The engine, a Pratt and Whitney Wasp, roars against the silence of the farm. The plane gathers speed, bouncing over the uneven, half-frozen turf. It lifts. It does not soar majestically. It struggles upward, a small speck of aluminum and fabric disappearing almost instantly into the low ceiling of the overcast sky. This is the threshold. This is the moment where history ends and the mystery begins. As the drone of the engine fades from the ears of the ground crew at Twinwood, Glenn Miller exits the known world. Let us reconstruct the flight. The plan is simple. Fly south-southeast, cross the coast near Beachy Head, traverse the English Channel, and land at Villacoublay or Le Bourget in Paris. The flight time should be approximately 2 hours. Inside the cabin, the conditions would have been deafening and freezing. The Norseman is not a pressurized luxury liner. It is a vibrating metal box. Miller, already sick with a sinus infection and terrified of flying, sits in the rear. Below them, the English countryside is a blur of gray and brown, rapidly swallowed by the fog banks. We must understand the sensory deprivation of this journey. For the pilot, John Morgan, the world outside the windshield is a wall of white. He is flying on instruments, trusting the gyroscopes and needles to tell him which way is up. But in 1944, in a small utility transport, these instruments are basic. As they cross the coastline and head out over the channel, the temperature drops. This is the critical variable. The air over the water is saturated with moisture. At freezing temperatures, this moisture does not just bounce off the airframe, it sticks. Carburetor ice, wing icing. It is an insidious, silent killer. Ice builds up on the leading edges of the wings, destroying the aerodynamic lift. It chokes the air intake of the engine, starving it of oxygen. There is no black box recorder. There is no distress call. The radio remains silent. The frequencies are empty. However, there is an intersection of events here that elevates this from a tragic accident to an instance of high strangeness. This is where the narrative fractures. At the exact same time, the small Norseman is struggling over the channel. A massive fleet of 138 Lancaster bombers from the Royal Air Force is returning from an aborted mission. They were sent to bomb the railway yards at Siegen, Germany, but the weather was too severe. They have been ordered to turn back. Standard operating procedure for bombers returning with a full payload is to jettison their explosives before landing, to minimize the risk of a catastrophic detonation on the runway. The designated jettison zone is a specific sector of the English Channel known as the South Jettison Area. At approximately 2:40 in the afternoon, the sky above the channel erupts. The Lancasters open their bomb bay doors. Hundreds of thousands of pounds of high explosives rain down into the gray water below. The sea churns. Shockwaves ripple through the mist. A navigator on one of the Lancasters, a man named Fred Shaw, looks down through his blister window. He sees the bombs falling, but he sees something else. In the midst of the chaotic splashes and the shockwaves, Shaw spots a small, high-winged monoplane. It is flying low, dangerously low, beneath the bomber stream. He watches, frozen in the glass bubble of his station, as the small plane seems to shudder. It is caught in the violent air pressure of the exploding ordnance below and the falling iron above. Shaw later describes seeing the plane tip over. It spirals. It is not a controlled descent. It is a leaf caught in a gale. The aircraft impacts the water. There is no fire. There is no explosion from the plane itself. Just a splash that is quickly lost among the hundreds of other splashes from the jettisoned bombs. Shaw keys his intercom. He tells the rear gunner there is a kite down in the water. The rear gunner confirms he saw it too. A small plane. Gone. They do not know who is inside. They do not know it is the most famous musician in the world. To them, it is just another tragedy in a war built on tragedies. They fly on, returning to base, the incident logged in their minds, but not immediately connected to the disappearance of a major. Back in Paris, the hours tick by. The band is waiting. The welcoming committee is waiting. The airfield at Le Bourget is cold, wet, and expectant. 3 o'clock passes. Then 4. The winter sun, already weak, begins to set, casting long shadows across the empty runway. The silence at the arrival gate becomes heavy. In the age before instant communication, a delay is just a delay. Maybe they turned back. Maybe they landed at a different field. The mind creates rationalizations to ward off the encroaching dread. But night falls, and the Norseman does not arrive. By the morning of December 16th, the unease has turned into a frantic, hushed panic among the Allied command. Glenn Miller is missing. This is not just a tactical loss. It is a blow to morale of strategic proportions. Eisenhower himself listens to Miller. The German radio stations, broadcasting propaganda, often play Miller's records to lure Allied soldiers into listening. He is a cultural icon, and he has vanished into thin air. The search that follows is desperate, but hampered by the war. The Channel is a war zone. Search and rescue planes scour the route, looking for yellow life rafts, for debris, for an oil slick. They find nothing. The gray water keeps its secrets. There is no wreckage, no body, no floating suitcase. The Norseman, a plane made of steel tube, wood, and fabric, has disintegrated or sunk into the silt of the Channel floor. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the announcement is finally made to the public. The BBC interrupts its broadcast. The voice is somber stripped of the usual holiday cheer. Major Glenn Miller is missing in action. The shock is global. It is a moment of collective cognitive dissonance. How can the man who defined the sound of the era simply cease to exist? The lack of physical evidence creates a vacuum, and human nature abhors a vacuum. Into this empty space, rumors begin to rush in. Was it the ice? Did the engine simply cough and die in the freezing mist? Was it the bombs? Did Glenn Miller die by friendly fire, swatting out of the sky by the very forces he was serving? A victim of a bureaucratic coincidence in a jettison zone? Or was it something darker? Whispers begin to circulate in the smoky backrooms of Paris and London. Stories of espionage, stories of a secret meeting, stories that he didn't die in the plane at all. The incident itself is over in minutes. The plane takes off. It flies into the fog, and it never comes out. It is a clean cut, a glitch in the timeline. One moment, he is standing on the mud at Twinwood, asking about parachutes. The next, he is a ghost, a signal lost in the static. This is the nature of the disappearance. It is not marked by a fiery crash on a hillside that can be visited and mourned. It is marked by absence. The anomaly is not what was found, but what was never found. As we stare back at December 1944, we are left with the sensory imprint of that day. The smell of high-octane fuel, the bone-deep cold of the English winter, the roar of the Wasp engine, and then the silence, a silence that has lasted for decades. The stage is set. The player has exited, but the curtain never came down. This concludes part 1, the incident. In the next file, we will deconstruct the investigations, the conflicting testimonies, and the enduring theories that transform this tragedy into one of the 20th century's most enduring liminal mysteries. To understand the void into which Glenn Miller vanished, we must first dismantle the popular image of the Second World War. We often view this era through the sanitized lens of newsreels and triumphant marches. But by late 1944, the war in Europe had become a grinding, industrial slog. It was a landscape of mud, freezing rain, and mechanical fatigue. This is the backdrop against which the mystery unfolds. It was not a time of glory, but a time of exhaustion. The date was December 15th, 1944. The Allied advance had stalled at the German border. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate counteroffensive, was only hours away from erupting, though the Allied commanders did not yet know it. Europe was shrouded in a heavy, freezing mist that grounded thousands of aircraft. This weather system is the first, and perhaps most critical character in our narrative. It was not merely bad weather. It was a meteorological wall that separated the British Isles from the continent. To cross this divide Miller did not board a heavy bomber or a fortified transport plane. He stepped into a UC-64, 1h10min. This choice of aircraft is the first significant variable in the equation of his disappearance. The 1h10min was a Canadian-built bush plane designed for the rugged lakes and forests of the north, not the hostile, anti-aircraft-laden skies of the English Channel. It was a single-engine utility aircraft, a workhorse rather than a thoroughbred. From a technical standpoint, the 1h10min was robust, constructed of a steel tube fuselage covered in fabric, with wings made of wood and fabric. It was powered by a single Pratt and Whitney R1340 Wasp engine. While reliable in the hands of a bush pilot landing on a frozen lake, the 1h10min had specific vulnerabilities when operating in the humid, freezing air of a European winter. We must look closely at the mechanics of this engine. The Wasp engine utilized a carburetor to mix air and fuel. In the specific atmospheric conditions present on that day, high humidity and temperatures hovering just near freezing, carburetors are notoriously prone to icing. As air accelerates through the carburetor venturi, the temperature drops further. If ice forms, it chokes the engine, starving it of air. The engine does not explode. It simply coughs, sputters, and dies. The 1h10min was equipped with a carburetor heater designed to prevent this. But the pilot's manual contains a crucial warning. It states that the heater must be engaged before icing begins. Once the ice has formed, the heater is often ineffective. It creates a paradox where the pilot must anticipate a problem that has not yet manifested. This technical limitation is a vital piece of context, often lost in the more sensational theories of friendly fire or espionage. Let us turn our attention to the human element, specifically the two men who accompanied Miller into the mist. While Miller is the famous face of this tragedy, the flight was orchestrated by Lieutenant Colonel Norman Beasell. Beasell is a figure who fits the archetype of the wartime operator. He was a fixer, a man who knew how to bypass bureaucracy to get things done. He was the executive officer of the 8th Air Force Service Command, a position that gave him access to aircraft and logistics. Beasell had a reputation for cutting corners. He was known to commandeer aircraft for personal convenience, often ignoring standard flight protocols. The flight on December 15th was not an officially sanctioned mission in the traditional sense. It was an unauthorized lift, a favor pulled by Beasell to get Miller to Paris ahead of the rest of the band. Beasell was eager to reach the liberated city, reportedly to check on a black market enterprise, or simply to enjoy the comforts of Paris before the army clamped down. His casual attitude toward regulations is the catalyst that placed Miller in that specific plane on that specific day. The pilot was Flight Officer John Morgan. Morgan is the variable that introduces the most doubt. He was young, roughly 24 years old, and while he was a qualified pilot, his experience with the Norsemen in instrument conditions is a matter of debate. The flight logs and service records from this period are often incomplete, casualties of the chaotic administration of the war. But we know that Morgan had previously been recommended for removal from flight status due to a lack of proficiency in instrument flying. This is a critical distinction. Visual flight rules, or VFR, require the pilot to be able to see the ground and the horizon. Instrument flight rules, or IFR, allow a pilot to fly solely by reference to the gauges inside the cockpit when visibility is 0. On December 15th, the weather at Twinwood Farm, the airfield from which they departed, was marginal at best. The weather over the channel was non-existent. It was a solid wall of gray. To fly into, that meant flying blind. If Morgan was indeed uncomfortable or unskilled with instrument flying, entering that cloud bank would have induced spatial disorientation within minutes. Twinwood Farm itself contributes to the liminal atmosphere of the event. It was not a major air base like the sprawling complexes of the 8th Air Force. It was a satellite field, a patch of grass and mud used primarily for training and RAF liaison flights. Today, it remains much as it was, a quiet, forgotten corner of Bedfordshire. On that day, it was freezing. Witnesses recall the damp cold seeping through their coats. The control tower at Twinwood was not equipped with the advanced radar or tracking systems found at larger bases. Once an aircraft lifted off the grass and banked away, it was effectively alone. There was no digital tether, no transponder pinging a server. There was only the roar of the engine and the static of the radio. The cultural context of 1944 also plays a role in why this mystery endures. Glenn Miller was not merely a musician, he was a tactical asset. The Army Air Force Band was a propaganda tool designed to maintain morale among the troops and project American cultural dominance. Miller was a perfectionist, a man obsessed with the precise arrangement of sound. He had traded a lucrative civilian career for the rigid structure of the military because he believed in the cause. However, Miller was also exhausted. He was suffering from a sinus infection. He was chain-smoking, and he was visibly anxious. He had a deep-seated fear of flying, a tragic irony considering his fate. Before boarding the Norseman, he reportedly complained to B-Cell about the lack of parachutes. B-Cell, true to his cavalier nature, dismissed the concern, joking that if they went down, the parachutes would not help them anyway. This fatalism was characteristic of the era. Death was a daily, administrative occurrence. The loss of a single aircraft, even one carrying a celebrity, was a statistical drop in an ocean of violence. We must also consider the airspace they were entering. The English Channel in 1944 was the most heavily trafficked and dangerous corridor of sky in human history. It was crisscrossed by bomber streams returning from Germany, fighter patrols, transport runs, and coastal command sweeps. It was also designated with jettison zones. These zones are a crucial, obscure detail. Allied bombers returning from missions with hung bombs, explosives that failed to release over the target, were instructed to drop them into specific areas of the channel before landing to avoid the risk of exploding on the runway. These zones were marked on charts, but in the fog and chaos of war, navigation was rarely precise. The airspace was a three-dimensional minefield of potential accidents. The flight plan, or rather the lack of one, is the final piece of the contextual puzzle. Because Bissell had arranged the flight informally, there was no filed flight plan with the standard air traffic control centers. No one at the destination in Paris knew they were coming. No one at the intermediate tracking stations was looking for a single-engine Norseman. This absence of paperwork meant that when the plane failed to arrive, no alarm was raised. It was not until days later, when Miller failed to appear for a scheduled performance, that the military apparatus realized he was missing. This delay is significant. In the cold waters of the Channel, hypothermia sets in within minutes. Survival times are measured in quarter hours, but the search for Glenn Miller did not begin for 3 days. By then, any debris would have drifted miles away or sunk. Any oil slick would have been dispersed by the choppy seas. The timeline of the investigation was broken before it even began. So we have the stage set for a disappearance that seems almost inevitable in hindsight. We have a weary, anxious celebrity. We have a rule-breaking officer. We have an inexperienced pilot with a questionable service record. We have an aircraft prone to carburetor icing in winter. We have a weather system that grounded the entire Air Force. And we have a flight path that cut through a chaotic, unmonitored void over freezing water. The disappearance of Glenn Miller is often treated as a singular, anomalous event, a bolt of bad luck. But when we analyze the context, when we look at the mechanical limitations of the Norsemen and the procedural failures of the men involved, the narrative shifts. It stops being a mystery of the impossible and becomes a tragedy of the probable. The elements were not conspiring to hide Glenn Miller. They were simply waiting for him. The technology of 1944 was advanced enough to kill on an industrial scale, yet primitive enough that a single carburetor valve could vanish a cultural icon. The radio silence that followed their takeoff was not just a lack of communication. It was the sound of the era. It was the static of a world where millions of men were moving through the fog, and not all of them were coming back. In the next part, we will analyze the timeline of that afternoon, the specific observations of the few witnesses who saw the plane depart, and the controversial theories that arose in the vacuum of evidence. We will move from the context of the era to the minute-by-minute breakdown of the flight into oblivion. Part 3. The investigation. The silence that followed the disappearance of the UC-64 Norseman over the English Channel was not immediate. It was a creeping, bureaucratic silence because the flight was unauthorized, a deviation from protocol arranged by Colonel Norman Beasel. No flight plan had been filed with the standard air traffic control entities of 1944 when the single-engine aircraft failed to arrive at Tausis-Lenoble airfield near Paris. There were no immediate alarms. The ground crews simply waited. The brass assumed a diversion due to weather. It was only on December 18th, 3 days after the wheels left the mud at Twinwood Farm, that the realization set in. Major Glenn Miller was not in France. He was not in England. He was nowhere. The initial military inquiry was swift, clinical, and ultimately hollow. The United States Army Air Forces initiated a missing air crew report, but the investigation was hampered by the chaos of war. The Battle of the Bulge was beginning to rage, resources were scarce, and searching the freezing, gray expanse of the Channel for a small transport plane was a logistical impossibility. The official finding was simple and devastating. Missing in action. Presumed dead. The likely cause was listed as engine failure or pilot disorientation due to poor weather conditions. For decades, this remained the only narrative, a tragedy of icing and fog. However, the nature of an unresolved disappearance is that it abhors a vacuum. Where evidence is absent, theory rushes in to fill the void. This brings us to the archival excavations and the conflicting testimonies that have turned the Miller case into a labyrinth of probability and hearsay. The most persistent alternative theory emerged years later, in 1984, introducing the concept of friendly fire. A former Royal Air Force navigator named Fred Shaw came forward with a jarring recollection. Shaw had been aboard a Lancaster bomber returning from an aborted raid on the German city of Siegen. The bomber formation, unable to drop their payload on the primary target, was ordered to jettison their bombs over a designated zone in the English Channel before landing. This area, known as the South Jettison Area, lay directly in the flight path Miller's Norseman would have taken. Shaw claimed that as he looked down through the bombardier's blister, he saw a small, high-wing monoplane flying beneath them. As the 4,000-pound bombs, known as cookies, fell from the Lancasters, the shockwaves, or the ordnance itself, struck the small craft, Shaw described seeing the plane flip over and spiral into the dark water. This testimony ignited the amateur investigation community. It provided a violent, tangible end to the mystery, moving it from a passive weather accident to a tragic error of war. It is here that we must apply the lens of digital archaeology. We are no longer looking at physical debris, but at the digital footprints of historical data. In the early 2000s, aviation historians and forum dwellers began cross-referencing digitized flight logs. They accessed the scanned archives of the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces. This is the texture of modern investigation. Staring at high-resolution scans of typewritten onion skin paper, looking for timestamps. The data presents a conflict. The logbooks for the Lancaster Formation confirm the jettisoning of bombs. However, the timing is precarious. The bombers released their payload around 1:40 in the afternoon. Based on the departure time from Twinwood Farm, the Norsemen should have passed that specific sector of the channel nearly an hour earlier. For the friendly fire theory to hold, the pilot, John Morgan, would have had to fly significantly slower than his cruising speed, or he would have had to deviate wildly off course. Furthermore, digital reconstruction of the flight path using modern simulation software suggests that the Norsemen, flying low to avoid icing, would have been difficult to spot from the altitude of the returning bombers. The debate rages on in specialized aviation forums. Threads on sites like the Professional Pilots Rumor Network stretch on for hundreds of pages. Users with handles like Old Crow and Spitfire Ace argue over wind vectors, the drag coefficient of the Norseman airframe, and the reliability of human memory 40 years after the fact. These forums are the new dig sites. Here, retired pilots and armchair historians dissect the physics of a carburetor icing event. The carburetor on the Norseman's Pratt and Whitney Wasp engine was notoriously susceptible to freezing. The weather reports from December 15th, 1944, preserved in meteorological archives, show a temperature of 34 degrees Fahrenheit with high humidity. This is the kill zone for carburetors. Without heated air intake, ice forms in the throat of the engine, choking off the fuel mixture. The engine sputters, then stops. Silence follows. In this scenario, the plane becomes a glider made of steel and fabric. Pilot John Morgan, not instrument rated and flying in thick fog, would have had zero visibility. If the engine died, the only sound would be the wind rushing over the struts. Impact with the water would have been catastrophic. The fixed landing gear of the Norsemen would catch the waves, flipping the aircraft instantly. Hypothermia in the December waters would render survival impossible within minutes. We must also address the noise, the sensationalist debris that clutters the investigation. For years, lurid tabloids and dark corners of the internet propagated the idea that Miller died in a French brothel or was assassinated by German spies or was on a secret mission to negotiate a surrender. These theories are largely dismissed by serious researchers. They rely on the complete absence of evidence, thriving on the dramatic rather than the probable. They are the static that washes over the audio of history, distracting us from the cold reality of mechanical failure. The investigation remains unsolved, not because of a lack of effort, but because of the medium in which the evidence is lost. The English Channel is a graveyard of machinery. The sea floor is littered with the wreckage of 2 world wars. Trawlers and fishermen have occasionally pulled up unidentified aircraft parts, a strut here, a propeller blade there. In 1987, a fisherman found an aircraft engine off the coast of France, initially thought to be from a Norseman. However, corrosion and the lack of serial numbers made definitive identification impossible. This brings us to the limitations of our digital reach. We can scan every document, simulate every wind current, and debate every timeline on fiber optic networks. But the physical truth lies beneath 300 feet of shifting silt and salt water. The Norseman was constructed largely of steel tube and fabric. The fabric has long since disintegrated. The wood has rotted. What remains is a skeleton of rusted metal, likely crushed into an unrecognizable shape, hidden among thousands of other wrecks. There is a profound melancholy in analyzing the police reports and military inquiries. You see the frustration of the officers. They were fighting a war on a massive scale. The disappearance of one plane, even one carrying a cultural icon, was a statistical inevitability they had to accept. The file was closed not because the answer was found, but because there was nowhere else to look. The digital footprints that remain are ghostly. They are the scanned letters of Miller's wife, requesting information. They are the grainy, digitized manifest logs. They are the unending arguments in the comment sections of history blogs. Why has this remained unsolved? Because the ocean is the ultimate destroyer of context. On land, a crash site tells a story. Skid marks, tree breaks, scattered debris patterns. In the water, the evidence is swallowed. The plane did not just crash, it was erased. The investigation into Glenn Miller's death is a study in probability. The most likely answer, carburetor icing, leading to a stall and crash, is the least satisfying. It lacks a villain. It lacks a climax. It is simply a mechanical failure in bad weather. But the human mind rejects the mundane death of a hero. We look for the bombs dropping from above. We look for the secret mission. We scour the archives for a conspiracy that will make the loss feel significant. rather than accidental. In the end, the evidence we have is negative evidence. We have the lack of a radio call, the lack of a verified wreck, the lack of a body. We are left with a digital dossier of what did not happen, surrounding a hollow center where the truth resides. The aircraft is still out there, somewhere in the gray sludge of the channel floor. The steel frame of the Norseman rests, until technology allows us to scan every inch of that seabed, or until a fisherman's net pulls up a serial plate that matches the records. The investigation remains in a state of suspended animation. It is a cold case, kept warm only by the friction of online debate and the enduring haunting quality of Miller's music. The file is open, but the pages are blank. Part 4. The aftermath. The telegram that arrived at the Miller home in Tenafly, New Jersey, carried the same sterile, devastating weight as thousands of others delivered during the winter of 1944. It was a standardized form of administrative grief. The message stated simply that Major Glenn Miller was missing in flight. It did not offer closure. It did not offer a body. It offered only a void where a man used to be. The legacy of the event is defined not by what was found, but by the absolute totality of the erasure. When a figure of such immense cultural gravity vanishes, the silence left in their wake is deafening. Miller was not merely a band leader. He was the sonic architecture of the Allied morale. His disappearance was akin to a radio transmitter suddenly going dead in the middle of a broadcast. In the immediate aftermath, the official military inquiry was swift but ultimately hollow. A board of officers convened to review the flight logs, the weather reports, and the maintenance records of the UC-64 Norseman. They found no negligence, no enemy action, and no survivors. On December 23, 1944, the announcement was made public. The reaction was a mixture of disbelief and a strange collective denial. For a generation raised on the clean resolutions of cinema and the triumphant chords of swing music, the idea that the music could simply stop without a finale was psychologically irreconcilable. This cognitive dissonance birthed a secondary legacy, one far darker than the music Miller left behind. It birthed a mythology of conspiracy. The vacuum of facts became a breeding ground for the grotesque and the improbable. Rumors began to circulate almost immediately, festering in the quiet corners of mess halls and eventually bleeding into the tabloids of the post-war era. There were whispers that the plane had landed in Paris, but Miller had died in a brothel, a scandal the military sought to bury beneath a hero's death. There were darker insinuations that he had been assassinated by German agents, or even by his own side, a victim of the chaotic espionage that defined the European theater. These stories are the artifacts of a public mind, trying to impose narrative logic onto chaotic tragedy. They attempt to replace the terrifying indifference of a mechanical failure or a weather event with human agency, however malicious. We prefer a villain we can name to a carburetor that simply freezes in the gray mist. Yet, among the noise of speculation, one theory emerged decades later that bears the cold, metallic weight of plausibility. It involves the jettisoning of ordnance, returning Lancaster bombers, unable to land with full payloads due to heavy fog, were instructed to drop their bombs into a designated zone in the English Channel. This was a standard, if hazardous, procedure. Years after the war, a navigator named Fred Fisher recounted seeing a small, single-engine aircraft struggling below his formation, just as the bombs were released. He described the plane flipping over, crushed not by the impact of the explosives, but by the sheer percussive force of the shockwaves. If this account is true, Glenn Miller was not lost to the mysterious ether. He was collateral damage, swatting out of the sky by the very machinery of the war he had volunteered to serve. It is a cruel, industrial end to a man whose life was dedicated to harmony. Today, the site of the disappearance remains as elusive as the man himself. There is no scorched earth to examine. There is no twisted fuselage rusting in a field. The site is the English Channel itself, a body of water that has swallowed armies and empires for millennia. It is a quintessential liminal space, a restless boundary between nations that belongs to no one. If one were to look for the crash site today, they would be staring at a shifting, monochromatic expanse of gray water. The coordinates are approximate, a calculated guess based on flight paths and wind speeds. The seabed below is a graveyard of anonymous metal. Sonar scans and divers have located barely recognizable debris in the area, engines encrusted with 70 years of marine growth, aluminum sheets dissolved into lace by the salt, but nothing that can be definitively linked to the Norsemen. The ocean is a corrupting archive. It breaks down evidence, scattering it with the tides, ensuring that the physical truth remains irretrievable. Instead, the true crash site exists in the media archives. It exists in the degradation of the recordings. When we listen to Glenn Miller today, we are engaging in a form of digital archaeology. The original master tapes and the shellac 78 RPM records are physical objects that are slowly decaying. Audio engineers and archivists work tirelessly to remove the pops, the hisses, and the static, attempting to exhume the pure sound from the noise of time. But there is a haunting quality to this restoration. When you strip away the surface noise of a 1944 recording, you are left with a sound that is almost too clean, too present. It creates an uncanny valley of audio, where the ghosts of the brass section sound as if they are in the room, playing a melody for a future they would never see. The recordings themselves have become a memorial to the unfinished. The song Moonlight Serenade, with its clarinet lead and slow, rolling rhythm, has transmuted from a pop hit into a requiem. It is impossible to hear it now without the context of the crash. The sweetness of the melody is curdled by the knowledge of the freezing water. The music has been corrupted by history. It is no longer just a song. It is the last transmission of a man flying into oblivion. We must also consider the digital footprint of this mystery. In the deep corners of internet forums and archived military databases, the search continues. Enthusiasts trade flight logs and weather charts, dissecting the same scant data points that have existed for 8 decades. They enhance grainy photographs of the airfield at RAF Twinwood Farm, looking for clues in the background shadows. The control tower at Twinwood still stands, restored as a museum. It is a place of pilgrimage, a physical anchor for a story that has no ending. Visitors report a sense of unease there, the classic sensation of a space where time has snagged. It is an abandoned stage, waiting for a performer who is perpetually late. What questions remain unanswered? They are technical, yet existential. We still do not know if the Norsemen suffered mechanical failure due to the carburetor heaters icing over, a known flaw in that aircraft model. We do not know if the pilot, John Morgan, became disoriented in the fog, succumbing to spatial vertigo, spiraling into the water without ever knowing which way was up. We do not know if Miller survived the initial impact, struggling in the freezing water for minutes that must have felt like hours, or if the end was instantaneous. But the most pressing question is philosophical. It asks why we are unable to let go. Why does the disappearance of a band leader haunt the collective consciousness more than the deaths of generals or statesmen? Perhaps it is because music is the closest thing we have to a human soul, codified in airwaves. When the musician vanishes, it feels as though the soul itself has been interrupted. The Glenn Miller story is a narrative loop that refuses to close. It is a file that cannot be compressed or archived away. It remains active, running in the background of our cultural history. In the end, the disappearance forces us to confront the fragility of our own footprint. We build our legacies. We record our voices. We photograph our faces, believing that these artifacts will anchor us against the flow of time. We believe that if we are loud enough, if we are famous enough, we cannot simply be deleted. Glenn Miller proved this assumption wrong. He demonstrated that even the most beloved, the most visible, and the most talented among us can be swallowed whole by the indifference of the physical world. One moment, there is a man in a uniform, boarding a plane, clutching a portfolio of musical arrangements. The next moment, there is only fog. The channel water is cold and opaque. The tapes are spinning in an empty room. The static rises, washing over the brass section, burying the melody under a layer of white noise. And in that static, we find the only absolute truth of this case. The unknown is not a puzzle to be solved. It is the natural state of things. We emerge from silence, we make our noise, and then, inevitably, we return to the silence. The mystery of Glenn Miller is not that he disappeared. It is that, for a brief, shining moment, he managed to be heard at all. This brings our investigation to its end. The file remains open, but the evidence has been consumed by the tide. The music continues to play, looping endlessly in the digital ether, a ghost signal from a war that ended long ago. This is the digital archaeologist, signing off.